Thank you for tuning in to this episode of HMD 259 Podcast. My name is Laquan McConico, and today we are going to talk about greeting and seating restaurant guests. Now, this is something that I thoroughly enjoy talking about because I work in a restaurant as a server myself, and I understand just how critical of a step this can be in the hospitality cycle in the restaurant industry. Now, we're going to talk about three main talking points today. The first of those talking points is going to be greeting guests. The host stand is usually the very first thing that a guest will see when they walk into a restaurant. And the host stand is directly responsible for making a guest feel as welcome as they possibly can. After saying hello, of course, you should ask your guest if they made a reservation, handle that if necessary, and asking them any special requests, like a booth or table. The entire time you should be handling this with positive body language, a smile, looking as friendly as you possibly can. If the restaurant is on a wait, make sure you're immediately telling them the amount of time that they'll be waiting, and make sure that you hand them a menu so they can scan the menu prior so they don't feel like they're waiting for nothing. Time flies when you're focused. HospitalitySchool.com's a website dedicated to teaching proper hospitality management techniques says that the employees who greet the guests should use very brief but welcoming phrases to greet those guests. And that is very true. One time I went to a Red Robin and the host spent at least 2 to 3 minutes telling me about his broken ankle, how he broke that ankle, and how he couldn't afford to get the cast because his mother canceled his health insurance. While it was a very sad story and I felt bad for him, I would have much rather preferred to be sitting down and looking at the menu, figuring out what I'm going to eat because I was very hungry that day. Recapping this first talking point, the host stand is directly responsible for making that great first impression. They have the power to turn an average visit into an extraordinary visit just by using positive body language and smiling. You should be handling reservations and special requests right away. And if the restaurant is on a wait, making sure you're telling them how long that wait is and handing them a menu. The host stand has the power here, and that is very important to remember when greeting and seating restaurant guests. Moving on to the next point, we're going to talk about the flow of seating. Many people might think when they walk into a restaurant that the host stand just crams them into the first open table that's available, when in fact, the process is much more, intricate than that, or at least it should be. Chef's Resources, a site that authored the article, Proper Seating and Flow of Restaurant Customers, says that proper service is more important than simply cramming butts in the seat. And that is very, very important. When you're seating guests, you should be looking at the occupancy of the restaurant and how close it is to the capacity of the restaurant. You should be thinking about how long it's been since you've last seated someone. And the main thing on your mind should be, is the kitchen making decent ticket times? An example that the article gave was, if the kitchen is already struggling to make those decent ticket times, it's really inefficient to seat more guests, because eventually there's going to be so much food in the window that servers aren't going to be able to run it out quick enough. And that's going to stall the kitchen even more than they already were. That's not mentioning all the food that might be sent back due to it drying out for sitting in the window for a long time. The host or hostess should take this into consideration, and if the kitchen is running a little behind, consider putting the guest on a small wait, telling the guest something along the lines of, "I'll be able to seat you in about 5 or 10 minutes. Is that okay?" And of course, following the guidelines from the first talking point, ensuring you're handing them a menu so everything will go just that much smoother when they finally are ready to be sat. Summarizing this talking point, the host or hostess should be looking at the kitchen to see if they are making decent ticket times. If the kitchen is falling behind, the host or hostess should consider maybe putting that guest on a small wait, because as the article said, it is much more efficient for the guest to receive proper and decent service than sitting at that table for an additional 20 to 30 minutes waiting on the food because you're trying to fill the seats as quickly as you possibly can. Moving on to the final talking point in this podcast, I like to call this the path to the table. And simply this just means the time that it takes to get the guest from the host stand to the table that they are assigned. At this point, you should already have any special requests taken care of. You should know whether your guest wants a booth or table and anything else that they might have told you during this time. Fred Langley, author of the article Tips for Upselling Success, said this: Upselling is a way to educate and inform the guest about their opportunities to improve their experience. He then goes on to explain some guidelines when it comes to upselling guests. This is a very, very, very critical step. If you remember during the first talking point, I told you that that the host stand has the power to turn an average visit into an extraordinary visit. And this is another opportunity to really, really do just that. First and foremost, you should understand the context of the visit as far as your guests are concerned. Are your guests in suits? They might be there for a business visit, and maybe you should suggest some quick, clean food to get them on their way. However, if you can tell your guests are about to unwind after a long shift at work, they might want some beer and some comfort food or finger food. Paying attention to these certain details can help you successfully upsell to a guest and enhance the visit for everyone. Now, the main thing I hear from people at my own job is that they don't like upselling or suggestive selling because it seems too pushy. And I agree, it absolutely can be if not done correctly. Fred addresses this in his article by saying you shouldn't bombard your guests with unnecessary information or too many choices early on in the selling phase. He says you should build a rapport, then engage and inform. I really like the ending part of that sentence, and essentially what he means is read your guests, get that context, know what your guests want, and then use the information you have to suggestive sell to them exactly what they'll need. This is a very, very critical step, and if you do this correctly, you can really make the visit not only easier on the server, but you'll make it easier on the kitchen. Really, you're helping the entire establishment just by suggestive selling on the way to the table. Summarizing this talking point, while you're walking the guests to the table, get some context clues, understand what they want, and then tell them exactly what they're going to need for their visit today. If you do this correctly, everyone in the establishment will be able to prosper, as food will come out quicker, servers will be able to take orders quicker, servers will be able to answer questions based off of the menu items that you suggested, rather than having to scan through the menu hoping to find something that their guest might like. We're just about ready to wrap up this podcast today. We're just going to go ahead and summarize everything that we've talked about today. Today you learned how to properly greet guests. You learned that you should always have a smile on your face and a positive attitude. You should do everything in your power to make that guest feel as welcome as possible. You should be handling any special requests like reservations, booth or table, and ensuring that you're responsibly placing them on the wait list and handing them a menu so they can scan it beforehand. We talked about the flow of seating and how the host or hostess should pay attention to ticket times and how the restaurant is affected currently so that you're not bombarding the kitchen with more orders than they can handle, ensuring that guests are receiving proper service instead of just sitting at a table waiting for food. And we also talked about what I called the path to the table, and at this point, you should be upselling to your guests, understanding the reason your guests came to the restaurant, and telling them exactly what they'll need to hear to ensure a quick and efficient visit, as this will help the server, the kitchen, and the entire establishment as a whole. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of HMD 259. I do hope that you guys learned how to properly seat and greet restaurant guests. And of course, all the information that I discussed in this podcast will be underneath in the blog, so you can see it in more detail there. I'm Laquan McConigal. Thank you so much for tuning in. Goodbye.